He stood in the middle of the lavish room, crystal lights casting sharp reflections across his cold face. In his hand was a half-full glass of champagne, and his eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for someone. The woman he once belittled, the one he left when she told him she was pregnant. He had invited her to this party in front of hundreds just to humiliate her. He wanted her to see that without him, she was nothing. But when the doors opened, the room fell silent. She walked in, not alone. Beside her were three young men, tall, composed, and the spitting image of him. He stood frozen. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor. In that moment, the world he thought he controlled came crashing down. Every eye turned to her, and he knew. He had just lost the most important thing in his life, but it was already too late. Naomi Johnson was a classical literature teacher at a small private school in Charleston, South Carolina. She lived simply, devoted to her students, and never imagined she'd step into the world of the wealthy. But then a phone call from the Whitmore family office changed everything. They needed her to tutor the niece of David Whitmore, one of the rising young tech founders. The first time Naomi met David, something about him felt different. He was polite, composed, but his eyes always seemed calculating. After their first session, he invited her for coffee to further discuss the curriculum. Under the dim lights of an upscale cafe, he smiled and looked her straight in the eye. "You're not like anyone I've ever met." That seemingly harmless sentence marked the beginning of a journey Naomi could never have foreseen. Naomi didn't think she could fall in love so quickly, but David made her believe in something magical. The next 6 months were filled with tenderness. Dinners by the riverside, surprise flights to New York, bouquets without cards just to make her smile. He didn't hide her. He brought her to events, introduced her to friends in the startup world, held her hand at galas. During a weekend at a lakeside villa in Tahoe, David held her from behind and whispered, "No one has ever made me feel peace the way you do." Naomi believed this was real love. She didn't dream of fame or fortune, just sincerity. She began to imagine a future, a little house, a garden, a child. She didn't know the man lying next to her had already begun to grow bored, and in his world, nothing lasted long. Naomi stood before the tall glass windows of the Whitmore Capitol building, clutching a small cloth bag. Inside were 3 pregnancy tests, all with the same result. She had checked 3 times, no doubt. She was carrying David's child. She entered the lobby. The receptionist recognized her, nodded politely, and pressed the elevator button. No warm greeting like before. David's office door opened. He stood, back turned, speaking on the phone. When he saw her enter, he stopped. No smile, no touch, just a cold, "What is it?" Naomi walked to his desk and gently placed the bag on it. David glanced down, then at her. "Are you sure?" He said. "It's mine?" That sentence was a slap to Naomi's dignity. Her lips trembled, but her eyes never left his. "You're the only one?" He said nothing, just poured himself a glass of whiskey, and with that the dream crumbled. David sat down, silent for a few seconds, then opened a drawer and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote quickly, as if eager to end the matter before it consumed another minute of his time. $100,000. He pushed the check toward Naomi, voice flat. "You can use this to take care of it. If not, never contact me again." Naomi stared at the paper before her. The numbers, the signature. It was as if he was pricing the life growing inside her. She lifted her head. "You think I came here for money?" David didn't answer. He pressed a button for security. A woman's voice came through the speaker. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore?" "Escort her out." Naomi stood. No tears, no begging. She walked out of the office, past curious stares in the lobby. Rain was falling. The check in her pocket, now soaked. But inside her a decision had already taken root. 3 days later, Naomi received an email from her school. Her contract had been terminated, no explanation, just a board decision. She had taught there for 4 years, thought it would be her lifelong job. She knew who was behind it. David didn't just want to avoid responsibility, he wanted to erase every trace of her. Naomi applied to other schools. No one called back. She started applying to cafes, bookstores, restaurants, but her growing belly made everyone turn her eye away. Eventually, she found a small apartment in a run-down neighborhood on the city's south side. It had one window, an old stove, and dampness that seeped into the walls. Naomi placed her hand on her belly. "We'll start again, from here." No one was left, just her and the unborn child. Naomi visited a community clinic on a freezing winter morning. Wearing a borrowed coat, belly swollen, legs numb from walking over an hour. The young doctor smiled as he placed the ultrasound probe on her belly. "Have you been more tired than usual?" "Exhausted," Naomi chuckled weakly. Sometimes I'm too tired to dream. Then came the heartbeat through the speaker, then another, and then another. 3 heartbeats, clear, strong. The room went quiet. It's triplets, the doctor whispered. Naomi froze. She stared at the screen, 3 tiny shapes flickering with life. Her eyes welled up, not from fear, but because she knew, from that day on, every step she took would be for them. She had no one. But she wasn't alone. Naomi began to live like a shadow. By day, she worked as a waitress in a small diner, wiping tables, washing dishes, hiding her 6-month belly as best she could. By night, she cleaned offices, returning home in the dark. One question, are you pregnant, could cost her the job, and she needed every dollar. One day, while folding napkins in the kitchen, the manager approached, eyeing her belly. You can't work here anymore. Customers feel uncomfortable. Naomi said nothing. She removed her apron and walked out the back door, freezing wind slapping her face. Standing on the street, she placed a hand on her belly and whispered, Don't worry, Mommy will find another way. That night, in her cold apartment, she opened her old laptop, a blank page flickering. She typed the first line, Learn Edge, learning your own way. Naomi began to teach herself everything from scratch. She slept in short bursts between shifts. At night, she sat before her ready for her flickering screen, the sticky keyboard under her fingers. She read about early education, studied Montessori methods, and learned basic coding from free videos. Every line of code brought her closer to her dream, an educational platform for children who had no resources. Ms. Mildred, the elderly neighbor, brought over a bowl of soup. What are you staying up for, dear? Naomi, eyes ringed with fatigue, smiled. I'm building a school for 3 kids who haven't even been born. The old woman laughed, but didn't ask more. Naomi looked at her belly and whispered, I can't give you a father, but I'll give you a world. At week 33, Naomi was typing lesson descriptions when a sudden pain bent her over the desk. She called an ambulance, voice shaking. In the emergency room, things moved too fast to comprehend. Doctors decided on an emergency C-section. 3 baby boys were born to the sound of machines and blinding lights. Each weighed less than 2 kilos, rushed straight to incubators. Naomi lay motionless, too exhausted to speak, but when she opened her eyes, the first thing she asked was, Are they okay? A young nurse took her hand and nodded gently. They are warriors. So is their mother. Naomi turned her head, gazing through the glass. 3 tiny figures breathing slowly and separating the incubators. She whispered, Micah, Elias, Caleb, Mommy's here. Naomi returned to her tiny apartment with 3 newborns, and no help. Every night was a battle. 3 cries, 3 bottles, 3 diapers. Every time she soothed one, the other 2 would wake. She didn't sleep more than an hour at a stretch for months. By day, she wore them in cloth slings, reading programming books and early childhood education manuals. At night, when they finally slept, she opened her laptop and kept building Learn Edge. Micah startled easily. Elias had trouble sleeping. Caleb spit up often. But Naomi never complained. Every night she looked at their tiny faces and told herself, Every line of code I write is a brick for their future. When they turned 3, the first version of Learn Edge launched. It was simple, but enough for a nonprofit to notice. And from there, Naomi's life began to shift. One March evening, Naomi received an email from Bridges for Learning, a program supporting educational initiatives for low-income communities. They invited her to an online pitch session for independent founders. Naomi had no blazer, no brand logo, no tech team, just 3 boys running around in a tight square-meter room. She set up a white sheet as a backdrop, adjusted her old webcam, and began. With a calm voice, she spoke of children who never learned the right way, of parents like her, with no means but big hopes, and of Learn Edge, coded from a mother's resolve. 10 minutes later, the screen went dark. At 10 p.m., Naomi received a reply. We'd like to fund your first round, $5,000, and provide a mentor. She stared at the email, hands trembling. For the first time in years, hope had a shape. Naomi used every dollar of that grant to hire a computer science student to redesign Learn Edge's interface. She didn't buy new things, didn't replace her laptop, didn't hire a nanny. Every cent was carefully planned. By day, her boys attended a free community daycare nearby. Naomi worked at this public library, where there was free Wi-Fi and printing. And her assigned mentor was Raymond Fields, a former product director from a top ed tech company, nearly 60, strict but fair. During their first Zoom call, he asked, Why should I believe this product will make a difference? Naomi stared straight at the camera and answered without hesitation, Because I've lived through the worst and I still believe in education. Raymond said nothing. But at the end of the call, he sent her a document. Start here. Naomi knew then. A new door had opened. Naomi entered a new rhythm. Still difficult, but now with direction. Mornings, she took Micah, Elias, and Caleb to daycare. At noon, she worked with Raymond via Zoom, learning business models, UX design, user behavior, and how to pitch to investors. At night, once the boys were asleep, she revised code, wrote lesson content, recorded voiceovers, and tested every small feature. Raymond wasn't easy. Every demo earned 3 pages of notes. But he always ended with, "You're improving, don't stop." Naomi wrote that on a sticky note and stuck it to her screen. One rare afternoon off, she took her boys to the park. Caleb climbed the slide and looked at her. "Will you play with me?" Naomi smiled. For the first time in years, she nodded. Today, yes. Success wasn't far away. It began right there. Naomi and Raymond submitted LearnEdge to a statewide education startup competition. Most applicants had full teams, marketing budgets, and backers. Naomi had nothing but an idea built from sleepless nights and 3 growing boys. The night before the pitch, Caleb had a high fever. Naomi stayed up with him, wiping his forehead, rocking him until morning. The next day, she had no time to prepare. Dark circles under her eyes, old blouse, hastily tied hair. She stepped onto the small stage at a local university, facing rows of stern faces. No flashy slides, no effects, just a calm, firm voice. "I have nothing to show off, just 3 sons, and a software I built to protect their future." The hall fell silent. At the end, one judge, a seasoned female entrepreneur, stood, walked to her, and said, "We don't need to see the product. We can see the mother behind it." A week after the pitching event, Naomi received a call from the state funding organization. They not only wanted to invest in the next phase, but also invited her to join a 6-month accelerator program exclusively for female founders. A $50,000 investment was wired into the account of her newly registered company, LearnEdge Inc. She didn't cry, didn't scream, she simply stared at the phone screen for a few minutes, then turned to the 3 little boys playing with building blocks on the floor. "We're about to have an office," she whispered. Elias looked up. "Are you getting a new job?" Naomi nodded. "No, I'm creating a job for myself." Within a month, she rented a small space in an old office building. Just 2 desks, a whiteboard, and the one big window that let sunlight shine directly onto her face every morning. Naomi wrote a sentence on the board with a marker. "No one gave me a chance. I created one." Naomi's new office was on the 3rd floor. No elevator, no signage. But to her, it was a castle. Every morning, she dropped off her 3 boys at school, then climbed the 3 flights of stairs with her laptop, a small lunchbox, and unwavering belief. Raymond came every Monday, sitting at the 2nd desk. They worked side by side like a team long forged in fire. Naomi gradually learned how to talk to investors, draft financial plans, and organize her first group of user testers. LearnEdge began receiving positive feedback from teachers and parents. A single mother emailed her, "Thanks to Lesson 3, my son read fluently for the first time. Thank you." Naomi printed it out and pinned it to the wall. She was still in debt, uninsured, and uncertain about the next year. But now, her dream wasn't just for her 3 sons. It was for all the children who had never been believed in. Micah, Elias, and Caleb were growing fast. Each had a different temperament. Micah was quiet and loved drawing. Elias was energetic and fascinated by numbers. Caleb was cheerful, always asking why about everything. Naomi was a mother, a founder, and the very first teacher of her own children. Every evening, after a simple dinner, she had her boys test the first LearnEdge lessons. Micah sat still, listening to the story The Last Leaf. Elias counted the animals in the game. Caleb kept pressing the wrong answers, but never gave up. Naomi recorded every reaction, every bug, every detail to improve the content for the next day. One night, Caleb lay on her lap and asked, "Mom, why do I have to learn this?" Naomi stroked his hair and whispered, "So that one day no one has to teach you who to become." Under the dim light, Naomi realized those small footsteps were her guiding light. One Monday morning, while Naomi was reviewing user data on the platform, a strange email appeared in her inbox. From David Whitmore at Whitmore Group.com. Subject, catch up? She stopped breathing for a few seconds. That name, that address, thought to have vanished from her life nearly 8 years ago, now reappeared in one line. She opened it. Short, polite, cold. "I've heard about your project. LearnEdge is getting media attention. Congratulations. If you have time, I'd like to invite you for coffee. No agenda. Just catching up with the pit." Naomi stared at the screen, silent. She remembered the cold office. The check. The blank stare, the indifferent voice. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood and walked to the window. Her 3 boys were playing tag in the schoolyard, laughing, carefree, unaware of the man who once chose to leave them. Naomi smiled, not because of the email, but because she realized she didn't need it anymore. 3 days passed. Naomi didn't respond to David's email. She thought about writing something. A polite decline, a final word, or just, I don't care anymore. But then she asked herself, why should I respond? He chose silence back then. Now, silence was her choice. Naomi focused back on work. LearnEdge was preparing to launch a new update with personalized learning features. Raymond was busier than ever, and her remote collaborator team had grown to 10. One morning, when she came to pick up her sons from school, the principal approached her. Your boys are wonderful. I've never seen a child work as hard as Elias. Naomi smiled and thanked her. But then the principal lowered her voice. A man came asking about them, said he was a relative. We didn't give him anything, but I thought you should know. Naomi froze. No need to ask. She knew who, and for the first time in years, she felt a storm quietly returning. That night, Naomi sat alone in the kitchen after her boys had gone to bed. The apartment was quiet, only the soft hum of the fridge and the faint yellow glow on the wooden floor. She opened her laptop and reread David's email. No follow-up message. But clearly, he had already gone to the school. He didn't need a reply. He just needed to show up the same way he disappeared. Without warning, without asking, without feeling. Naomi closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to her son's room. She gently opened the door. Micah hugged his pillow. Elias mumbled in his sleep. Caleb curled against the wall. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating each of their faces. 3 lives. 3 reasons why the past could never intrude on the present. The next day, she wrote to her lawyer, updated all custody documents, and secured all personal data within the school system. Not out of fear, but because now she had something to protect. And no one, not even their biological father, had the right to threaten that. 3 weeks later, Naomi received an invitation to speak at a national education conference gathering hundreds of founders, experts, investors, and journalists. The organizers wanted her to share the journey of building LearnEdge, a platform written by a mother for the forgotten children. Naomi hesitated. She had never spoken in front of such a large crowd, but Raymond just smiled and said, no one can tell that story better than the one who lived it. On the day of the event, she wore a simple blue dress, tied her hair neatly, and stepped onto the stage under bright white lights. She began with a soft line. I didn't come here with an MBA. I came with 3 bottles, 3 strollers, and a small dream. The room fell silent. She spoke of sleepless nights, of her 3 boys, of the old laptop and the first lines of code. No flashy images, just the truth, and that truth moved people to tears. After the speech, Naomi became the center of unexpected attention. A reporter from Inside Edition approached her backstage asking to do a special feature. A single mother who turned adversity into an educational empire. Naomi was flustered. She never imagined her story would be broadcast to millions. As long as I don't have to pretend to be stronger than I really am, she said. The reporter smiled. No need. You're already stronger than anyone. Within a week, her story appeared on several major media outlets. LearnEdge's social media numbers soared. Educational organizations reached out to partner. Parents wrote letters thanking her for creating a platform that understood their children. Naomi read every message. But one made her pause. I used to be a child no one believed in. Now I'm a teacher. Thank you for reminding me why I chose this path. Naomi placed her hand over her heart. In that moment, she knew what she had gone through wasn't just to survive. It was to pass on light to others. One weekend afternoon, Naomi took her 3 sons to the city library for a community reading event. The boys were older now, able to sit through sessions, even volunteer to read aloud. Naomi sat in the back row, smiling as Micah turned pages. Elias adjusted the mic for his brother, and Caleb forgot the middle part, but confidently improvised his own words. After the reading, a man approached her. Excuse me, Naomi Johnson. She turned. It was a television production assistant. We just received confirmation that David Whitmore will appear in a panel with rising education founders, and he requested that you attend as a special guest. Naomi froze. Yes? He requested? Yes, he said, I will only appear if Naomi Johnson is present. A weight pressed against Naomi's chest. She didn't answer right away, but deep down she knew. The time for a final confrontation might be near, and this time she wasn't coming to ask for anything. Naomi spent the entire evening reflecting on the invitation. She wasn't afraid to face David. Not anymore. but she wasn't sure she needed to show up to close a past she had already outgrown. Raymond called. "Are you going?" Naomi was silent. "He once tried to erase you from his life," Raymond continued. "Now he needs your presence to prove he wasn't wrong. You owe him nothing." Naomi sighed. "I'm not going for him. I'm thinking, maybe someone out there needs to see a black woman, a single mother once abandoned, walk onto that stage and not bow her head." Raymond chuckled softly. "Then you must go." Naomi opened the email and typed into the reply box, "I'll be there. Not as David Whitmore's guest, but as the founder of LearnEdge, a platform currently supporting over 300,000 students." She hit send. This time she wasn't coming to be looked down on. She was coming to be seen, made fully and wholly. On the day of the panel, Naomi arrived early, not to rehearse a speech, but to reacquaint herself with rooms that once made her feel like an outsider. Polished floors, leather chairs, gleaming glass walls. The coordinator led her to the VIP lounge. Every gaze followed her to say no longer with pity or doubt, only curiosity and respect. She wore a minimalist cream suit, hair in a high bun, her steps firm and steady. Raymond arrived a few minutes later, shaking her hand like a partner. When Naomi Johnson's name was announced, the hall burst into applause. She stepped into the spotlight, facing hundreds. And one familiar face in the front left row, David Whitmore. He looked at her, but this time she didn't lower her eyes. She looked straight at him, offered a slight smile, and nodded, as if greeting a former acquaintance far too late to reserve a place in her life. The panel began, and the real story of Aste was just beginning. Naomi sat in the center chair on stage, the mic placed on a small table in front of her. The host started with the usual questions about her startup journey, early challenges, growth metrics. Naomi answered calmly, concisely. Each response carried the weight of unseen years. Then the host shifted gears. "You were once a single mother with nowhere to teach, sleeping less than 3 hours a night, sitting here now in front of those who once didn't believe in you. How do you feel?" Naomi looked up, eyes scanning the room, and landing right on David. She spoke slowly, clearly. "I'm not here to make anyone regret. I'm here for 3 children who once had no beds of their own, ate cold rice for 2 years, and still believed their mother was doing something meaningful." Applause broke out. Naomi didn't take her eyes off David. "I don't need validation from the past. I am the result of my own choices, not anyone's abandonment." David lowered his head. For the first time, he was the one without words, and Naomi needed none. The panel ended. The hall rose to applaud as Naomi stepped off stage. A few investors approached to exchange contacts. Some journalists requested interviews, but she politely declined. She entered the backstage area, removed her mic, and let out a deep breath. Raymond was waiting with a bottle of water. "You just taught this entire room a lesson in dignity," Naomi smiled. But before she could respond, a voice called from behind, low, still, familiar. "Naomi." She turned. David Whitmore stood there. No longer the powerful CEO, no smug smile. Just a middle-aged man, hands clasped in front of him, trying to hold himself together. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. That face, that voice, was once everything to her, now just a shadow. "You don't need to say that to me, though," she said gently. "You should say it to the 3 children outside, if they want to hear it." Then she turned away, no bitterness, no insult. Just a woman who had chosen to close the old door forever. That night, Naomi didn't say anything to her sons. She made dinner as usual, watched cartoons with them, and read books before bedtime. But once the lights were off, Elias whispered from the top bunk, "Mom, I saw someone watching you today." Naomi paused. "That was someone I used to know," she answered softly. "That man is your father." Micah sat up. What does he want?" Naomi took a deep breath. "He wants to meet you." Silence. Then Caleb asked quietly, "Will you be sad if we don't want to?" Naomi walked over and sat between their 3 beds. She placed a hand on each of their heads. "No, because you have the right to choose. No one can force you to love or forgive, not even me." Micah, Elias, and Caleb nodded. They needed nothing more. They had each other. And they knew blood doesn't make a family. Love and truth undo. A week later, Naomi received a handwritten letter. Not an email, no PR headline, Not a public apology, just a few neatly written lines. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I only want to see the boys once, if they'll allow it. I'll sit quietly, say nothing, make no requests, not even my name. I just want to know what I missed. David Whitmore. Naomi handed the letter to her sons. Micah read it first, then quietly folded it. Elias bit his lip, saying nothing. Caleb asked, "Will he cry?" Naomi gave a soft, sad smile. "Maybe, because those who realize they were wrong often cry, when they see how far the right thing has gone without them." In the end, the boys agreed. They chose to meet him, not to give him a place in their family, but to show him that family existed, even without him. And sometimes that's the hardest truth a father must witness. The meeting was arranged in a small conference room at the city library, a neutral place, with no cameras, no media, no assistants. Naomi entered first, holding Caleb's hand. Micah and Elias followed, each with a different expression. Micah quiet, Elias tense, Caleb curious. David Whitmore was already there, sitting at the far end of the table. No suit, no laptop, no phone, just a man trying to sit up straight, though his eyes were heavy with weight. He stood when he saw them. "Thank you for coming," he said softly and slowly. The three children said nothing. Naomi sat to the side, not interfering. She only observed. David looked at each of his sons. His eyes reddened when he saw how uncannily Elias resembled him. He opened his mouth, then closed it. No words felt right. Caleb tilted his head. "What are you going to say?" David lowered his eyes. "I don't know. I just wanted to see you once." Micah tightened his grip on Elias under the table. No one stood, no one cried. But in that room there was a kind of terror that ran backwards into the heart. The meeting ended after 15 minutes. No hugs, no nicknames, no commemorative photo. David stood in silence as the boys walked out one by one, as if each step pulled him farther from what he had just realized was most important. Naomi was the last to leave. Before closing the door, she turned and looked at him one final time. "They don't hate you," she said softly, "but they don't owe you love, and you no longer have the right to ask for it." David nodded, eyes fixed on the empty space where the boys had sat. "I know it is." Naomi exhaled gently. "You chose to leave when they didn't have a voice. Now they do, and you'll have to learn how to live with their silence." She closed the door, leaving David alone in the empty room. This time no one kicked him out, but he knew. He had lost the right to stay long ago. A month after the meeting, Naomi was invited to accept the Pioneer in Community Education Award at a major event in Washington, D.C. This time she wasn't the unemployed teacher with a pregnant belly walking in the rain, not the silent mother coding by night while her children burned with fever. Naomi stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause from thousands. She looked down at the front row. Micah, Elias, and Caleb sat there in white shirts, each growing strong, confident, and proud. When the host handed her the award, Naomi didn't read the prepared speech. She simply said, "I was once told I wasn't enough. Not powerful enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough to be chosen. But I realized what people don't give you, you must create for yourself." She raised the trophy high. "And when a single mother can build an education for thousands of children, never tell anyone they can't." The whole room rose to their feet. This applause was not for a victim. It was for a survivor, a leader, a light. The night she received the award, Naomi got a short message. Just 3 words. "Thank you." No signature, but she knew who it was. She didn't reply. The boys were asleep. The trophy sat on the shelf, glimmering under the desk lamp. Naomi sat alone, replaying her speech. She didn't watch herself. She watched the 3 small faces clapping in the crowd, Micah sitting upright, Elias grinning, Caleb cheering when the camera found him. They didn't know their father had once turned away, but now they knew what it meant to have a mother who never did. In a small apartment in North Chicago, David watched the same video, alone. He paused on the frame where Elias tilted his head and smiled, the same smile David had at 28. For the first time in his life, David didn't feel like someone who was left behind. He realized he was the one who walked away, and he understood. Some lessons in life are never taught, but must still be learned, even if it's late, even in silence. Even just to know you once had a chance, and lacked the courage to keep it. On a quiet Sunday morning, Naomi took her boys to the neighborhood park. Not for a public event, not to film a video or meet with investors, just a day off, so rare and complete. She brought a basket of food, a few books, and an old blanket to spread under a tree. Micah read. Elias worked on math puzzles. Caleb chased sparrows and asked, "Mom, are they related?" Naomi burst out laughing. She lay back on the grass, eyes on the cloudless sky. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking of the next goal or product strategy or expectations. Only this moment, the scent of grass, her son's laughter, the wind through her hair, a mother, 3 children, a normal morning. But to Naomi, it was the most beautiful thing life had ever given her. No titles, no glory, just peace, which she had walked through hell to reach. In a small drawer of her old desk, Naomi kept a stack of handwritten letters. No one had ever read them, no recipients, no stamps. They were letters she wrote during the darkest nights. When tuition was unpaid, diapers were running out, the laptop keyboard was broken, and the cries of 3 babies overlapped into a dissonant song. Each letter began the same. If anyone is listening, in them she confessed her fear, exhaustion, the shame of not affording medicine, the lies like, "Mommy's not hungry," just to give up her last meal. She never meant to send them. They weren't for anyone else. Just a testimony that she didn't give up. That night after her boys were asleep, Naomi opened the drawer, took out one letter and read it again. Then instead of folding it back, she tore it into small pieces and fed it into the fire. She whispered, "I don't need anyone to listen anymore, because I've found my own answer." LearnEdge officially surpassed 1 million users after nearly 6 years of operation. The media called it a post-pandemic educational miracle, while analysts hailed it as a rare humane model that preserved its core in the era of optimization. Naomi only smiled when she read those words. To her, it had all started with one thing, a mother's love, with no choice but to move forward. One day, the product team suggested changing the platform's slogan. The old one's too long. LearnEdge, learning your own way. We want something punchier, like lead, break limits. Naomi paused for a few seconds, then shook her head. "No," she said. "Value isn't in speed. It's in the right to learn in your own way. That's something my mother never had. And something I want every child to receive." The room went silent. No one made another suggestion. Because at LearnEdge, every word, every lesson bore the mark of a mother who had once relearned everything, just so her child would never learn in the dark as she did. Micah began writing short stories. Elias won a state-level math competition. Caleb still asked questions that left adults speechless, like, "Mom, if we forgive but don't forget, is it still forgiveness?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She just pulled Caleb into her arms and held him close. The babies who once lay in incubators were now almost as tall as she was. Each had a personality and a dream, but they shared one thing, eyes full of confidence and a deep belief in their worth. One afternoon, Micah walked into the kitchen and placed a sheet of paper on the table. "I want to change our last name. We talked about it. We want to take your name." Naomi froze. Her hand stopped mid-wash at the sink. "Are you sure?" Elias nodded. Caleb replied as if it were obvious. "He didn't raise us. You're our whole family." Naomi pulled all 3 into her arms. She said nothing, not because she was sad, but because for the first time in her life she knew what she had planted had bloomed, and the 3 names bearing Johnson would no longer just be her sons. They were the living legacy of everything she had endured. One autumn afternoon, Naomi received a letter with embossed gold edges from the office of the dean at the University of Charleston. The school she once dreamed of teaching at, but this time the letter wasn't a job application. It was an invitation to receive an honorary degree and deliver the commencement address. "We want our students to know that a degree is one path, but courage is the foundation, and you embody that." Naomi held the letter for a long time. That evening, she told her boys while pouring milk, laughing, "Mom's been invited to speak at her old school. The one that once said I didn't fit in." Elias frowned. "So, will you go?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, not for them, but for the kids sitting in those seats, and who once thought they weren't enough." Micah asked softly, "Will you talk about us?" Naomi smiled, placing her hand on his shoulder. "No, I'll talk about 3 little heroes who saved a mother from giving up." The graduation was held in a grand domed hall that had seen thousands walk into the world with degrees and dreams. Naomi stood backstage. No speech, no teleprompter. She chose to take the stage with nothing but her bare heart, the way she had lived. In the audience, Micah, Elias, and Caleb sat among students, no longer boys of yesterday, but with eyes carrying the memories of an extraordinary path. Naomi stepped forward. The mic clicked on. The room fell silent. She looked around, then spoke. You might think I'm here because of success, but no, I'm here because I've failed. Because I've been rejected, hungry, afraid, and alone. A few students lowered their heads, eyes glistening. I had no degree when I started. Just 3 children and one reason I couldn't quit. She paused, took a deep breath. And I learned this. What keeps us going isn't titles. It's the ones who look at us every day, hoping we won't give up. Her eyes stopped right where her boys sat. Sometimes the most precious thing you have is someone who still believes in you when you don't believe in yourself. Applause thundered. This time not for a single mother, not for a startup, but for a soul who had lived true and survived. After the ceremony, many students approached for photos, handshakes, and thanks. Some cried, some stood in silence as if carrying Naomi's story into some quiet place within them. On the way back to the hotel, Caleb asked, Mom, what if someone wants to make a movie about you one day? Naomi laughed. I think I'd tell them not to overdo it. Elias cut in. No, they should tell everything, like when you got rejected for jobs or when you carried us to the clinic in the rain. Micah thought for a moment, then said, If it's a movie, what should it be called? Naomi glanced at them in the rearview mirror. 3 faces. 3 living proofs of her choices, her rejections, her sacrifices. She smiled. Maybe. The one no one chose, but who chose herself. And from that moment, Naomi knew. If someone ever told her story, nothing needed to be added, because the truth was enough. 1 year after graduation, LearnEdge launched the For the Unseen scholarship program, dedicated to students who are underprivileged, unheard in the system, or marginalized by circumstances. Naomi didn't put her name on it. She entrusted management to a group of alumni who were among the platform's earliest users. She only wrote one line in the introduction. I didn't create this fund to repay kindness. I created it to give back. To those who have never received. The program received thousands of applications in the first month. Some came from poor areas in Mississippi, others from refugee camps, even handwritten letters from juvenile detention centers. Naomi read every line, every trembling but heartfelt handwriting. She knew that feeling. Writing down hope without believing anyone would read it. One afternoon, she stood in front of LearnEdge's new office, watching young faces enter to receive the first support grants. No one knew the place they stood was built from tears, poverty, cold refusals from a man, and from love that never needed to be returned. Naomi smiled. The door once slammed shut before her was now open, and she did not walk through it alone. One summer afternoon, Naomi brought her 3 sons back to the old apartment complex, where she lived early days as a single mother, staying up nights writing her first lines of code beside a broken heater. The building had been renovated and freshly painted, but the stairs still creaked and the windows rattled when the wind blew. This is it, Mom? Elias asked, surprised. Naomi nodded. The exact apartment on the 2nd floor at the end of the hall, where Caleb once slept in a cardboard box lined with an old blanket. Caleb's eyes widened. I did? She laughed. You don't remember, but I never forgot. An elderly neighbor recognized them and invited all 3 boys into the backyard. She pulled out an old camera. Your mom used to sit right there, holding you, typing on the computer. Now it's your turn to sit there for her. Naomi hesitated, but her sons cheered and pulled her in. The photo was taken. No forced smiles, no hidden flaws. Just 4 people sitting close together in the late sunlight, a silent testament that every crack can become a foundation, and every loss, if it doesn't break you, will lead you home. One late autumn day, Naomi was invited as a keynote speaker at an international conference on applied education, gathering hundreds of representatives from global organizations. Her speech this time was not about her startup journey, but focused on the core philosophy, learning to be free, not to fit in. When she stepped off the stage, the entire hall stood and applauded. Naomi bowed and walked past the front row. Then her eyes stopped, just for a second, on a man sitting silently at the far end, his hair grayed, face somber, but eyes still following her as if the old days had never passed. David Whitmore. He didn't stand, didn't wave, didn't try to approach, just a stranger, in the crowd, quietly watching a life he no longer belonged to. Naomi didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't hate. She simply turned away gently, because now she had moved far beyond needing validation, and she understood better than anyone. Some people come into our lives only to teach one lesson, that without them we can still become extraordinary. One late night after her children had fallen asleep, Naomi sat alone before a blank screen. It wasn't programming code or a product development plan. It was the first line of a book many had urged her to write for 3 years, but this time she wrote not to inspire the world. She wrote to remember, for herself, and for other mothers who silently walk in the dark. She typed the first line, "I didn't start from a dream. I started from fear, and every step I took was a lesson in loving without needing to be loved back." The book title appeared in the center of the page, simple and clear, the one no one chose. Naomi sat quietly for a long time, fingers still resting on the keys, eyes fixed on the title as if looking straight into her younger self. The young woman with empty hands and a broken heart. This time, no tears, no doubt, just a very gentle smile. 'Cause finally the one no one chose herself and never looked back. The book The One No One Chose was released quietly, without a major publicity campaign, sensational memoirs, or flashy covers, but after just 3 weeks it topped the bestseller lists in true stories and inspirational women. Not because Naomi told the story beautifully, but because thousands saw themselves in every line. A teenage girl wrote a handwritten letter. "I once thought I wouldn't live past 18, but now I think maybe one day I can rewrite my own life too." A Latina mother shared via livestream, "I don't need sympathy. I need someone to show me that overcoming is real. Naomi did it. Not by magic, but by not giving up every day." Naomi received hundreds of interview invitations, but she chose only one program. A children's book reading at the public library where she once sat in winter writing the first lessons for LearnEdge. When the host asked, "How does it feel when the whole world is telling your story?" Naomi smiled, "I just hope next time they'll tell it to those still living in silence. Because what I ever needed was never fame, but to not be invisible anymore." One Monday morning, Naomi visited an elementary school in South Carolina, the first to implement the full LearnEdge curriculum. She didn't notify the press nor wore a founder badge. She quietly stepped into the classroom as a mother, someone who once longed to see children learn the right way. In a small classroom, she sat at the back. The teacher was guiding a group of students reading from an interactive screen, using the very content Naomi had written on weary nights and amid the cries of little children. A boy in the front row read hesitantly, "The pigeon is not afraid of the wind." The whole class applauded. The teacher smiled brightly. The boy smiled too, as if believing for the first time that he was enough. Naomi turned away and wiped a tear. In the hallway, a brown-skinned girl with curly hair holding a notebook looked at Naomi and asked, "Who are you?" Naomi bent down and smiled gently. "I'm just someone who was never taught, so I want to make sure you'll never have to learn alone." The girl nodded and ran off. Naomi stood there amid the sounds of life, no stage, no spotlight, no one recognizing her. But she knew this was where she belonged, where the silent dream had become obvious reality. That evening, back home, Naomi opened her email and saw a message from a major investor, the very one who had bluntly rejected her during her first pitch. "I was wrong. LearnEdge is not just a learning platform. It's a movement. If you're ready to expand globally, we want to join you." Naomi read it over and over. She wasn't angry or triumphant. She just gently scrolled down and didn't reply. She closed her laptop, stood, and went to her children's room. Micah was drawing, Elias researching international scholarships, and Caleb was loudly reading a comic book to himself. Naomi leaned against the doorframe. She wasn't thinking about global expansion. She thought about the old wooden chair in the library where it all began, about the days no one believed her, and about the feeling when a child reads their first line without fear of mistakes. Outside, the world measured success by capitalization, rates, downloads. But she measured it by something simpler, by the number of children who know they have value, without needing anyone to confirm it. And to Naomi, that was an achievement no investment could buy. An international education event was held in New York. Naomi was invited as a special guest, but this time she didn't go on stage, didn't speak, and was not under the spotlight. She chose to sit in the back row, quietly observing new founders, young passionate faces sharing their models, dreams, and visions. One young speaker spoke about her mother, a night janitor, illiterate, but always believing her daughter could achieve more than the world expected. Naomi gripped the chair tightly. She knew that story, not because she had heard it, but because she had lived it. During the break, a young woman nervously approached, holding her project draft. "Ms. Naomi, could you please look at this? I never thought I'd meet you here." Naomi took it, sat beside her, read slowly, nodding at every page. "Very good idea, but you need a bit more. Don't just solve problems. Start with trust. In the learner." The girl nodded, eyes shining. "Thank you." You don't know how long I've waited for this meeting. Naomi smiled. I know, because I once sat where you are, and wished someone would sit beside me. In the noisy crowd, no one recognized the woman in the old brown coat at the back who had changed a generation, but she didn't need to be seen, because now she was the one silently seeing others. One late afternoon, Naomi stood before the bedroom mirror, buttoning her shirt. Today she wasn't going to a presentation, signing a contract, or attending a media event. She was attending Elias's high school graduation. Micah was studying art. Caleb was still the youngest, but almost as tall as his mother. Elias, once silently lying on her chest in the emergency room, was about to begin his own journey. Naomi sat among the parents' seats, amid cheers and stage lights. When Elias stepped up to receive his diploma, his eyes scanned the crowd, stopping briefly but clearly on her. Not to ask permission, but to say, I've arrived. And Naomi nodded. No tears, no sobs, just a deep feeling. She no longer had to prove anything. Not to anyone, not to the past, not to the world that once turned its back. She used to live to show someone she was worthy. Now, she lived to see those once tiny in her arms, big enough to fly without asking permission. And in that silence was the loudest victory of her life. Not an anniversary, not a birthday, no award ceremony or invitation, just an ordinary morning. Naomi woke early, brewed coffee, opened the window, letting sunlight flood the kitchen. Micah had moved near the art school. Elias was preparing international scholarship documents. Caleb was sleeping in, as any youngest child at 15 would. Naomi sat at her desk, opening a worn notebook. Not to plan, but to jot down a few thoughts. Life used to be a storm. Now it's a gentle breeze. Still blowing, but no longer sweeping me away. She looked around the house. Not luxurious, not spacious, but every corner an item made by her own hands. No more cries at night, no more trembling over bills, no more questions. Am I enough? Now no applause, no praise, but Naomi understood. The greatest victory isn't in the spotlight, it's living an ordinary day, without feeling the need to apologize for existing. One weekend afternoon, Naomi received a package with no sender listed. Inside was a book, the first print edition of the one no one chose. Worn, spine frayed, first page marked with bold, slightly shaky handwriting. I read every line as if it were a sentence for myself, and I accept. On the last page, just a short line. Thank you for rewriting your life without waiting for anyone's approval. And then Naomi paused. No need to guess. She closed the book and placed it on the shelf. Among unfinished manuscripts, her children's scholarship notes, and thank you letters from students across the country. No bitterness, no forgiveness, no closure needed, just the truth, read all the way through. And Naomi knew, sometimes the last person to read the story you wrote is the one who left at the first chapter. But when they return, the story has moved so far, so it no longer needs them at the end. Naomi sat on the rooftop on a cool night, with a wind blowing through her hair, the city below still noisy, as if there was no place for silence. She had just finished a live video chat with a group of students in Uganda, children using the LearnEdge local language abridged version. An 11-year-old girl asked during the call, My mom says poor girls shouldn't dream too high. But Ms. Naomi, were you ever poor? Naomi smiled, remembering her answer, said slowly at the time, I once had nothing, but never lacked belief in myself. Tonight, Naomi didn't think about the future. Expansion plans, downloads, or fundraising. She just looked at the sky, not searching for anything, but because she knew she no longer had to go anywhere to become herself. This journey had no glorious ending, no final curtain, no swelling music, just a woman. Once no one chose who still chose to live, to love, and to leave footprints for those yet to come. And so, the story continues, somewhere else, somewhere, with someone else, for someone who will read it, and know they too can start again. That night, Naomi entered Caleb's room. The boy was asleep, the desk lamp still on, and on the table lay a draft college essay starting with, My mother was the first to teach me that failure is not the end. It's just a pause, waiting for me to continue. Naomi gently folded the draft and placed it on the shelf. She tucked the blanket around him, then sat on the bed's edge, looking at the child she once held through hunger and despair. She bent her head and whispered, not calling his name, Thank you. Thank you for coming when I thought I had nothing left to believe in. Caleb didn't hear, but it wasn't words that needed a reply. It was a mother's message to her own journey. Knowing every loss, every wound, every sleepless night ultimately had meaning. No audience needed, no applause, just one child writing the first line. with the strength a mother had to build silently, and for Naomi, that was enough. A whisper, a new generation, a love tale continued. The next morning, Naomi woke early. No events, no urgent emails, no busy schedule. She brewed tea, opened the window, and sat down to write a single line in a worn notebook. The one that had accompanied her from the days before Learnage, before an office, before a bed for her 3 children. Today she wrote just one line. Ultimately, the most important thing is what no one can ever take from you. Not fame, not opportunity, not recognition, but inner strength, quiet perseverance, dignity needing no praise, the choice not to turn back, some day even when all doors close. Naomi closed the notebook and looked toward the slowly rising dawn behind old rooftops. The light was not overwhelming, not dazzling, but it still came, just like how she lived, step by step, breath by breath, rising again, until she became the dawn for others. And no one could ever take that away. No one, ever. One afternoon, Naomi and her 3 sons returned to the public library where it all began, where she first wrote code, where unsent letters were tucked into a backpack, where the last refuge, Feiente, and the true beginning once was. The library had been renovated. It had a children's reading area, study rooms, and a new glass wall engraved with the words, "Where the forgotten rewrite their destiny." Naomi Johnson. Micah took photos. Elias stood quietly, reading the line over and over as if engraving it into his heart. Caleb asked, "Mom, do you think we'll write something as good as that someday?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She stepped to the wall, lightly touched the engraving, not to confirm she had done something great, but to remind herself she once was nothing, and that was what made everything that came after worth it. She turned to her children. "You won't have to write like me, you'll write your own. But make sure..." She looked at all 3, smiling. "Never let anyone else hold the pen to write your life." They left the library as night fell. No stage lights, no music, only steady footsteps and a story. Not ended, only paused here. Because the next part will no longer be written by Naomi, but by those she has touched, continuing her story. A few months later, a young teacher from New Mexico sent Naomi a short video. It showed a poor desert classroom using the offline version of LearnEdge. Children sat under a tin roof, light from a small window shining onto a worn whiteboard. A girl stood up, shy but a firm voice. "I'm not the smartest in class, but I believe I still have the right to learn." The whole class applauded. The teacher looked at the camera, choked up. "We don't have much, but thanks to the platform you created, my students no longer think they're less than anyone else." Naomi watched the video once, then again, not because of the image, but because of that sentence. Short, but the most truthful echo of all her years of struggle. "I believe I still have the right to learn." Naomi replied with one line. "The flame I carried is no longer in my hands. And that is just right." It wasn't pride. It was the deep relief of someone who knew she no longer had to carry the world on her shoulders, because the flame had been passed on, and will continue to burn in the hands of those who once thought they had nothing. One day, Naomi unexpectedly received an invitation to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of the company David Whitmore was leading. Not as a special guest, no speech, just a private invitation with a note. "Your presence is how I remind myself of the greatest lesson I learned too late." DW. Naomi didn't go, not out of anger, not refusal, but because she didn't need to return to a place that never chose her, to know how far she had come. Instead, she took Caleb to the park. They sat eating ice cream, listening to street music, watching strangers laugh as if the world had never known pain. And Caleb asked, "Do you still think about him?" Naomi shook her head. "I don't call that the past anymore, because it no longer pulls me back." She looked at her son and continued, "Some people come into our lives only to teach a lesson. When the lesson's done, we just keep living." Caleb nodded, didn't ask more, because he knew his mother wasn't pretending to be strong. She had truly moved on. On LearnEdge's 10th anniversary, Naomi didn't speak or hold a gala. She wrote a short letter and posted it on the company bulletin board. "If a child knows they have the right to learn, to make mistakes, and to start over, then we have succeeded." She walked through the new office hallways, where every employee knew they weren't just working, but continuing a story that began in silence. No photo of Naomi hung in the lobby. No statue, no meeting room named after her. because she left nothing needing to be honored. She left something needing to live on, a philosophy. A belief that learning isn't a race for rankings, but a journey to reclaim belief in oneself. At the end of the day, Naomi closed her laptop, grabbed her keys, and walked out of the office. She didn't look back, not because she didn't care, but because she knew the greatest things don't need her to stay to survive. They live on through those who continue. And Naomi had gone far enough to believe it would always continue. Naomi sat alone on a wooden chair on the porch, the sunset's last light falling softly like a breath. In her hand was a new notebook, blank with no words written yet. Micah had become an artist, holding his first exhibition in Brooklyn. Elias had begun an internship at a global education organization. Caleb had just received his university acceptance letter. No one in the house called Mom every 10 minutes. No more footsteps running down the hall, but also no more anxiety, no more sleepless nights over bills or hospital stays. Naomi opened the notebook. On the first page she wrote, "This is not the last page. It is only the first page of another story, one I no longer have to write alone." She lifted her head and looked straight toward the horizon. No more dreams to wish for, no more seeking approval, no more burden or strain, because she knew herself in that silent and determined journey had done what no one ever did for her, choose to live, choose to believe, and choose to rewrite fate, with hands once deemed meaningless. The wind softly blew across the page, and the story said and closed, but its echo would continue, in other voices, in eyes that once saw themselves as outsiders, and in everyone who was once no one's choice, but still dared to choose themselves.